The ship had been dead for 42 cycles, and Kelsey was dying with it. She lay curled in the pilot's alcove, with her long digitigrade legs folded beneath her, and her thin arms wrapped around her chest like she was trying to hold herself together from the inside out. And maybe she was, because everything else had already fallen apart around her. The lights had gone first, then the heating, then the water recycler, and now the air scrubbers were wheezing their last breaths, like old animals ready to lie down and never get up again. And the only light left in the entire wreck of the Vailani scout vessel came from Kelsey herself, from the faint and stuttering bioluminescence that rippled across her pale blue skin in weak pulses of silver and gray. Gray meant despair among her people, and silver meant acceptance of death, and she had been cycling between the two for days now. She could not remember the last time she had eaten, and the nutrient gel packs were gone, and her body had started consuming itself in that quiet, efficient way that Vailani biology handled starvation, breaking down muscle before organ tissue, extending the process, making the dying slow and clean and orderly, because even in death, a Vailani was expected to be dignified. Kelsey had never been very good at dignity. She had never been very good at anything her people valued, if she was honest about it. And she had plenty of time for honesty, now that there was nobody left to lie to. She was a junior stellar cartographer, the lowest rank on a survey convoy, and she had gotten that position only because nobody else wanted to be assigned to the deep frontier, where the stars were unmapped, and the routes were dangerous, and the glory was non-existent. And she had wanted it because the deep frontier meant being far away from the cities, and the crowds, and the endless social rituals that made her feel like she was drowning, even when she was standing on solid ground. The Vailani were a proud and ancient species, beautiful by most galactic standards, with their tall, slender frames and their luminous skin, and the way their chromatophores could paint emotions across their bodies like living art. And Kelsey had all of those things, except that her chromatophores stuttered. When she was nervous, or afraid, or overwhelmed, which was often, her bioluminescence would flicker and skip and stammer like a broken display screen, and among a people who communicated half their meaning through light patterns, this was not just awkward, but something close to a disability. And she had spent her entire life watching others dim their own lights in second-hand embarrassment when she tried to speak, and her skin betrayed her with its broken rhythms. She had no family left to miss her, and her crewmates had died in the pirate ambush that tore the convoy apart. And the Vailani sovereignty would have received the automated distress log by now, but she knew they would not come, because the Vailani had a word for people like her: Extraviada, lost. And among her people, the lost were already dead, because the void was vast, and resources were precious, and sentiment was a luxury that ancient civilizations could not afford. And so the Vailani did not search for the lost, and they did not mourn the lost, and they did not speak their names again, because to be lost was to have already passed from the world of the living into the world of the forgotten. Kelsey whispered her own name into the dark just to hear it one more time, before the universe swallowed it forever. Kelsey Voranthi, she said, and her voice was barely a rasp, and her chromatophores flickered that broken stutter even now, even with no one watching, and she almost laughed at that, because of course they did. Of course, even her own body could not give her a graceful death. She closed her eyes and let her light dim to almost nothing, and waited for the cold to finish what the pirates had started. And then the proximity alarm screamed. It was the one system still clinging to power, wired directly to the emergency battery, and it shrieked through the dead ship like a living thing. And Kelsey jerked upright so fast that she cracked her head on the alcove ceiling and saw white stars behind her eyes that had nothing to do with bioluminescence. Something had dropped out of faster-than-light travel, almost on top of her wreck. Something massive. And the sensor readout was garbled and half dead, but it painted a picture of a vessel that was enormous and powerful, and broadcasting on every single frequency simultaneously, in dozens of languages she did not recognize, and a few she did. The message repeated over and over in mechanical translation, and the Vaylani version was clumsy and grammatically wrong, but perfectly understandable. "This is the UESS outstretched hand. We have detected your distress signal. We are here to help." KLC stared at the sensor display, and her chromatophores went haywire, flashing shock white and confusion yellow and something she could not name, some color she had never made before, and she pressed her face to the viewport and saw the ship. It was the ugliest vessel she had ever seen. It was massive and asymmetric and covered in welded repair patches and mismatched hull plating, like it had been broken and rebuilt a dozen times, and kept going out of pure stubbornness. And it bristled with antenna arrays and sensor dishes and docking arms and rescue grapples. And it radiated more raw power from its engines than a Vaylani light cruiser. And it was painted in bold white and orange stripes that served no tactical purpose whatsoever. She had heard whispers about this species on the frontier, stories passed between traders and diplomats and soldiers, in tones that mixed admiration with unease, and something that sounded almost like fear, stories about a young species from a small wet planet who had stumbled into the galaxy and refused to play by its rules. Humans. The airlock of the dead ship groaned and then cycled, powered from the outside, and atmosphere rushed in, warm and rich and breathable. And Kelsey gasped and choked and felt tears she did not know she had left, streaming down her face. A figure stepped through the airlock in a heavy environment suit that was as scarred and patched as the ship it came from, and it moved with careful, steady purpose, scanning the wreckage, and then it saw her, huddled in the alcove, and it stopped. The visor retracted, and beneath it was a face unlike anything she had ever seen. Warm brown skin, and dark eyes, and black hair cut short, and a jaw covered in rough stubble. And the face was strange, and alien and soft, in ways she did not understand. And the small forward-facing eyes were doing something that made her chromatopper stutter wildly, because those eyes looked at her like she mattered. He knelt beside her slowly, the way one might approach a frightened animal, and he said in broken, terrible Vaylani that was somehow the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, "Hey, you are safe now." And Kelsey, who had been lost and alone and ready to die in the dark, looked into the face of the human called Mateo Reyes and felt something crack open in her chest that was not a rib, but something much older and much more fragile. And her skin, her broken, stuttering, traitorous skin, bloomed with light. Kelsey woke in a room that was warm and bright and alive, with a soft humming vibration that she could feel through her bones. And for several terrible seconds she did not know where she was, and her chromatophores flashed panic white across her entire body before her memory caught up with her fear. The human ship. They had carried her aboard, the one called Mateo and another crew member whose name she had not caught, and they had been so careful with her that it made her throat ache, supporting her weight between them and speaking to her in that clumsy translated Vaylani, even though she could barely hear them through the roaring in her ears. And then there had been a medical bay and a kind-faced woman with dark skin and bright, curious eyes, who had said something in the human language that sounded like music. And then Kelsey had fallen into the deepest sleep of her life. Now she was lying on a bed that had been adjusted for her digitigrade legs, and there was an IV line feeding nutrients, calibrated to Vaylani biology, into her arm, and the lights in the room had been dimmed to the blue-violet spectrum that her species found most comfortable. Someone had researched this. Someone aboard this alien vessel had taken the time to find out what kind of light a Vaylani needed to feel safe. and they had changed the lights for her. For one lost stranger they owed nothing to. Kelsey lay there and stared at the ceiling and felt something dangerous happening behind her ribs. The doctor came in after a while, the same woman from before, and she introduced herself as Dr. Anais Okafor, and she smiled with her whole face in a way that Vailani never did, because Vailani expressed warmth through chromatophore patterns, not through the crude rearrangement of facial muscles. But somehow the human smile translated anyway. Somehow Kelsey understood it perfectly, and it made her chest hurt in that strange new way. Dr. Okafor explained everything, slowly and clearly, that the nutrient solution was a best approximation based on Vailani biological databases, that Kelsey was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but would recover fully, that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed, and she said all of this like it was obvious, like rescuing a dying alien and rebuilding your medical protocols around her biology was simply what one did on a Tuesday. Why? Kelsey asked, and her voice was still raw and thin. Dr. Okafor tilted her head like the question did not make sense to her. Why what, sweetheart? Why did you help me? I am no one. I am lost. I have nothing to offer you, and my government will not pay for my recovery, and I cannot. Oh, honey, Dr. Okafor said, and she reached out and took Kelsey's hand. Just took it, skin to skin, casual and warm. And Kelsey flinched because among Vailani you did not touch someone you had just met. You did not touch someone who was lost. You did not touch at all. Unless you had earned the right through years of social bonding. And this human woman was holding her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. You do not need a reason to be helped. You just need to need help. Kelsey did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing, and her chromatophores said everything, cycling through colors she could not control, shock and confusion, and something warm and terrified that she did not have a name for. Over the next several days, she learned the shape of the human ship and the shape of the humans inside it, and both were equally strange and wonderful. The UESS Outstretched Hand was a search and rescue vessel, she learned, one of hundreds that humanity sent into deep space for the sole purpose of finding people who were in trouble and helping them. And this concept was so alien to Kelsey that she had to ask Mateo to explain it 3 separate times, because she kept thinking she was misunderstanding the "You go out looking for strangers to save," she said. Yes, Mateo said. Any strangers? Not just humans? Anyone. And your government pays for this? The people pay for it through taxes, and they are proud to do it. But why? He looked at her with those small, soft, forward-facing eyes, and she could see that he was not confused by the question, but saddened by it. Saddened that she had to ask at all. Because nobody should have to die alone in the dark, he said, and he said it simply, like he was stating a fact as basic as gravity. The crew of the Outstretched Hand was 23 humans, and every single one of them was insane by Vailani standards. They ate together in a large common room, all of them at once, loud and chaotic, passing plates of food back and forth, and talking over each other, and laughing. And the laughter was the thing that got to Kelsey the most, because she had never heard anything like it. Explosive, uncontrolled sound that burst out of humans when something delighted them. And at first, it startled her so badly that her chromatophores went full panic white, and the whole table went quiet. And then Mateo explained what laughing was, and she felt foolish, but also fascinated. They touched each other constantly, clapping shoulders and bumping elbows, and one crew member ruffled another's hair as she passed, and the recipient just grinned and swatted at her hand. And none of it was ritualized or earned or formal. It was just the way humans existed in the world, constantly reaching out to remind each other that they were there. They played music in the corridors, actual music coming from speakers mounted on the walls, and a young engineer named Torres sang while he repaired conduit panels, his voice echoing through the metal hallways, and the music was sometimes fast and bright, and sometimes slow and aching, and it filled the ship with something Kelsey had no word for, but wanted desperately to understand. And they asked her questions, not interrogation questions, not strategic questions, not what is your rank and what is your clearance and what intelligence can you provide, but real questions, curious questions, hungry questions. What do your stars look like from your homeworld? Asked a navigator named Chen. Do your people have music? Asked Torres, who was already playing her samples from a dozen human cultures. What is your favorite food, so we can try to make something close? Asked the cook, whose name was Big Miriam, even though she was the smallest person on the ship. Nobody asked what she was worth, and nobody asked what she could give them, and nobody asked whether she deserved to be here. And the sheer, overwhelming kindness of it hit her like a physical force, and she had to excuse herself and go back to her quarters and sit in the dark while her chromatophores blazed through every color she had, because she could not contain what she was feeling and did not know how to name it. She started keeping a journal on the datapad they gave her, and she titled it On the Improbable Nature of Humans, and the first entry read simply, "They are impossible and they are real, and I do not understand how both of those things can be true at the same time." She began spending time on the observation deck during the night cycle, when the lights were low and the stars were bright through the viewport, and she almost always found Mateo there, sitting alone, looking out at the dark, with an expression that she was beginning to learn meant sadness in human facial language. They talked, slowly, through the translation software, and through gestures, and through the halting vocabulary she was building in his language. And he taught her the Spanish word for what she had been before they found her. Extraviada, he said, and when she repeated it back to him, something shifted in his eyes, and he nodded. Had said something much larger than a single word. She wanted to ask about his sadness, but she did not know how, not yet. So instead, she sat beside him in the dark, and let her chromatophores shift to a soft violet, which was the Vellani color of empathy and shared feeling. And she did not mean to do it, but her skin had always been more honest than she was. He noticed the color, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, and the stars turned slowly outside the window, and the ship hummed its living hum, and Kelsey thought that maybe this was what it felt like to not be lost. Then the transmission came from the Vellani sovereignty. Mateo read it on the bridge, and Kelsey was not there, but she learned later what it said because a crew member told her, not in cruelty, but in the honest, blunt way humans shared hard truths. The individual Kelsey Varanthi is classified as lost. The sovereignty does not reclaim the lost. Dispose of her as you see fit. That was it. Her entire existence reduced to one line of bureaucratic dismissal. And when she heard it, she felt her chromatophores go gray, and her chest cave in, like the vacuum had finally gotten inside her. But Mateo had already handled it. He had deleted the message from her queue before she could see it, and he had turned to his bridge officer and said 4 words that she would carry inside her chest for the rest of her life, like a second heartbeat. She is crew now. And he logged it, made it official, gave her a designation and a role, and a place on a ship full of strange, loud, impossible creatures who refused to let the universe decide who mattered. Kelsey stood in the corridor outside the bridge and pressed her hand to the metal wall, and felt the hum of the human ship beneath her palm, and her skin glowed so bright that Torres stuck his head out of a junction panel and shielded his eyes, and said, "Hey, new girl, you are beautiful, but you are blinding me." And she laughed. She did not know she could make that sound, but it came out of her anyway, clumsy and strange and stuttering, just like her light, and it was the most human thing she had ever done. 3 weeks into her life aboard Outstretched Hand, Kelsey discovered that she was extraordinary. She had never been told this before, and she did not believe it at first, when Mateo brought her to the navigation bay and asked if she could look at their star charts of the sector, because the human maps of this region were, in his words, basically guesswork held together with optimism. And she looked at the charts, and her cartographer's instincts nearly shut her body down, because the maps were terrible. Not just inaccurate, but fundamentally wrong in their assumptions about stellar drift and gravitational topology and the way nebula density affected faster-than-light corridor stability. And she said so, carefully, because she did not want to insult them. And the navigation officer, Chen, looked at her and said, "Yes, that is exactly why we need you. Can you fix them?" And Kelsey sat down at the station and began to work. Hours. When she finally looked up from the display, her corrections had expanded the usable navigation corridors in the sector by 37% and identified 2 previously unknown stable FTL routes and flagged a gravity anomaly that would have torn apart any ship unlucky enough to stumble into it. And the entire bridge crew was standing behind her in a half-circle, staring at her work with their mouths open. "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen on a nav display," Chen said. "She just saved about 200 ships from that gravity pocket alone," said the first officer, whose name was Commander Vasquez, and who rarely expressed emotions louder than a raised eyebrow. Mateo looked at Kelsey, and his face did that thing humans did, where they pressed their lips together, and their eyes went bright, and she was learning to read this expression as pride, fierce, warm pride, directed at someone you cared about. And he said, "Told you, crew." The cartography station as her own, and she worked at it every day, and every day her maps grew more detailed and more precise. And the crew treated her contributions with an admiration so open and unguarded that it made her chromatophores cycle through helpless spirals of pleased embarrassment. Dr. Okafor noted in her medical log that Kelsey's bioluminescence had increased in intensity by 40% since she came aboard, and that her chromatophore patterns were stabilizing, stuttering less, growing bolder and more confident. And she wrote in the margin of the file, in handwriting that was not meant for official records, "I believe she is happy, possibly for the first time." Then the distress calls came, and Kelsey learned something new about humans, something that went beyond kindness into territory she had no map for. The first call was from a Dreth cargo hauler caught in a gravity well, its engines failing, its crew of 12 slowly being pulled toward a death they could see coming through their viewports, and the Dreth were a species that had fought a bitter border war with humanity less than a decade ago. And there were crew members aboard the Outstretched Hand who had lost friends in that war. Mateo did not hesitate, and neither did anyone else. They pulled the Dreth ship free with grappling tethers, and repaired its engines, and fed its crew. And the Dreth captain stood on the deck of the human ship, surrounded by the faces of his former enemies, and wept, great heaving sobs that shook his massive armored frame, because his own kind had heard his distress call, and calculated that the cost of rescue exceeded the value of his cargo and his crew, and decided to let the gravity well have them. "We would not have come for you," the Dreth captain said to Mateo, and there was shame in his voice, so heavy it bent his spine. "I know," Mateo said, and there was no anger in his, only something tired and sad and unbreakable. "Problem, not a us problem." The second call was worse, not in danger, but in what it cost Kelsey personally. A Vaylani border patrol vessel with failing engines, drifting just inside sovereignty space. And when the Outstretched Hand answered the call and pulled alongside to render aid, the Vaylani officers looked through their viewport and saw Kelsey standing on the human bridge, and their chromatophores flashed disgust red and shame orange, and they looked away from her like she was something rotting. She was lost, and she was standing among aliens, and both of these things made her less than nothing in their eyes. The humans repaired their engines anyway, efficiently and without complaint, and the Vaylani departed without a single word of thanks, and Kelsey stood at the viewport and watched the ship that carried her people fly away from her, and her light went gray and dim, and she hugged herself in that way she did when she was trying to hold the broken pieces together. Matteo came and stood beside her, and he did not touch her, because he had learned that she needed to be asked first, and he did not offer empty comfort, because he had learned that she valued honesty over softness. And he just stood there, warm and solid and present, and said quietly, "Their loss." And she was not sure if he meant the engines or her, but the ambiguity felt intentional and kind, and her chromatophores flickered violet before she could stop them. These events piled up inside her like evidence in a case she was building without meaning to. A case for something she had never believed was real. Because the Vylani taught their children that the universe was cold and indifferent, and that survival meant matching that coldness with efficiency and pragmatism. But the humans seemed to operate on a completely different principle. A principle that said, the universe might be cold, but we do not have to be. And every time they flew toward danger to help a stranger, they were making an argument against the dark with their bare hands and stubborn hearts. Kelsey wrote in her journal, "They are not naive. They know the void is merciless. They have lost people and ships, and they grieve those losses deeply. But they go out anyway, again and again. And I think this is what courage actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make decisions about who deserves to live." And somewhere in the middle of all of this, between the star charts and the rescues and the loud, messy human meals and Torres singing in the corridors, Kelsey fell in love with Mateo Reyes, and she did not even realize it was happening until it had already happened. It crept in through small moments, through the way he brought her warm drinks during long cartography sessions, because he had noticed she worked better when her hands were warm, through the night cycle conversations on the observation deck, where he finally told her about his wife, Elena, who had died in a colony plague 3 years ago, how he had held her hand while she burned with fever, and told her stories about the ocean, because she had always wanted to see Earth's ocean and never got the chance. He told Kelsey this with tears running down his face and no shame at all, and she realized that humans did not see grief as weakness, but as proof of love, that they carried their dead not as burdens, but as treasures, and she thought that was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever encountered in a galaxy full of wonders. He taught her to cook empanadas in the ship's tiny kitchen, his hands guiding hers through the folding of the dough, patient and laughing when she got flour on her chromatophores. And she taught him to read basic bioluminescent emotional patterns, the simple ones like happiness gold and calm blue and sorrow gray, and he studied them with the same intensity he brought to rescue operations. And her skin began doing something new, something she had never experienced before, a slow, warm oscillation of gold and rose that appeared whenever Mateo was nearby, a color she had never seen in any Vylani textbook. And the first time Dr. Okafor saw it, she smiled a knowing smile and said absolutely nothing. Kelsey wrote in her journal, "I have been extraviada my entire life, not because I was lost in space, but because I was lost among people who never looked for me." Then one evening on the observation deck, Mateo looked at her and said, "That color you make, the gold and pink one, what does it mean?" And every light on her body went out at once like a power failure, and she fled to her quarters and locked the door and pressed her back against the wall and shook, because she knew what it meant, even if she had never felt it before. And she knew that she was lost, and the lost did not get to want things, did not get to reach for things, did not get to feel this enormous, terrifying warmth for a man from another species who had pulled her out of the dark and shown her that the universe was not as cold as she had been taught. She whispered to herself in the dark, "You are lost. The lost do not get to want things." But her skin glowed gold rose in the dark of her quarters, defiant and involuntary and warm, and it would not listen to her. It had never listened to her, and for the first time in her life, she was grateful for that. The distress signal came screaming across every channel, like a wound torn open in the fabric of space itself. And Kelsey was at her cartography station when it hit. And she knew, before the translation software caught up, that it was bad, because the signal was not a clean automated broadcast, but a ragged, desperate voice. Someone speaking fast and terrified, and begging in 3 languages for anyone to come. A massive civilian transport, called the Wandering Garden, had been attacked in the border region between unclaimed space and the edge of Vaylani sovereignty territory. And it was carrying over 2,000 passengers, families and children, and elderly travelers on a routine colony transfer run, and the attackers were already boarding. Mateo was on the bridge in under a minute, and his face had changed from the gentle, patient man Kelsey knew into something harder and sharper, and focused in a way that reminded her that humans were predators by evolution. Forward-facing eyes were built for tracking prey, and she felt a shiver run through her chromatophores that was not fear, but something electric and complicated. "Report," he said, and Commander Vasquez gave it to him fast and clean. The attackers were the Holotums, a pirate and slaver collective that operated across the border regions, taking captives from vulnerable transports and selling them to the dark markets on the galactic fringe. And they were the same faction that had destroyed Kelsey's convoy and left her to die. And when she heard their name, every light on her body flared white-hot before going completely dark. The Wandering Garden was crippled, engines destroyed, weapons offline, and 3 Holotongue raider ships were locked onto it like parasites feeding on a dying animal. And their soldiers were already inside the transport, already moving through the corridors toward the passenger decks, where 2,000 people huddled in terror behind locked doors. That would not hold. Mateo looked at the tactical display, and Kelsey could see him doing the math in his head, the terrible arithmetic of a good man facing impossible odds. Because the outstretched hand was a rescue ship, not a warship, armed with emergency cutting tools and grappling equipment, but nothing that could match the firepower of 3 military-grade raider vessels. And the nearest Terran military response was 14 hours away. 14 hours was a lifetime, and everyone on the bridge knew that in 14 hours there would be no one left to save. Mateo called the full crew to the common room, and he stood in front of them and told them everything: the numbers, the odds, the weapons disparity, the distance to backup. And he did not sugarcoat it, and he did not dress it up with speeches about duty or glory, because these were humans, and humans did not need to be tricked into bravery. "There are 2,000 people on that ship," he said, "and if we do not go, no one will, and I am not going to order anyone into this, because this is not what we signed up for. This is not a rescue operation. This is a fight, and some of us might not come back. So I am asking, what do we want to do?" The vote was unanimous, and it took less than 3 seconds. Torres said, "We go," and Big Miriam said, "Obviously we go," and Chen said, "Already plotting the intercept course." And Dr. Okafor said, "I will prepare the medbay for mass casualties." And 23 humans looked at their captain with steady eyes, and not one of them flinched, even though Kelsey could see the fear in them, could read it in their elevated breathing and their clenched jaws and the slight tremor in their hands. They were afraid, and they were going anyway. This was the moment Kelsey understood what humanity was. Not the kindness, though the kindness was real. Not the curiosity, though the curiosity was boundless. Not the laughter or the music, or the way they touched each other with such easy warmth. But this willingness to walk into the fire for people they had never met. This absolute, bone-deep refusal to turn away from suffering, even when turning away was the smart and safe and rational thing to do. They were terrified, and they went anyway, and that was the most human thing of all. Kelsey stood up from the back of the room where she had been watching, and her chromatophores were blazing so bright that people squinted, and she said in the clearest voice she had ever used, "I know these pirates, and I know this space, and I can get you there faster and closer than your navigation computer thinks is possible. I am coming with you." Mateo looked at her, and she saw something move through his eyes that was complex and layered and human. And he nodded once and said, "Show me what you have got, cartographer." And she did. Kelsey had spent weeks mapping every gravity well and stellar mass and dark matter pocket in this sector. Precision that no human instrument could match. And she had found things in the data that the automated systems missed. Subtle gravitational corridors that threaded between the mass shadows of a nearby moon and a dense asteroid cluster. And she calculated a micro-jump trajectory that would drop the outstretched hand out of FTL directly between the transport and the pirate flagship, using the moon's gravity shadow to mask their approach until they were already on top of the enemy. It was a maneuver that no sane navigation computer would attempt, because the margins were measured in kilometers, and the room for error was essentially zero. And Chen looked at her calculations and went pale, and then looked again and said, "This is either genius or suicide." And Kelsey said, "It is both. Are we doing it?" And Chen grinned a wild human grin and said, "Punching it in now." The jump was perfect. The outstretched hand exploded out of FTL like a fist through a paper wall, filling the combat space with emergency broadcasts on all frequencies, jamming pirate communications, flooding the Wandering Gardens intercom with Mateo's voice telling the passengers to hold on because help had arrived. And then the humans fought with everything they had, which was not weapons, but something better, which was ingenuity born from desperation. Grappling tethers designed to stabilize wrecked ships became boarding lines that latched onto pirate hulls and locked them in place. Emergency hull foam meant to seal breaches was pumped through the tethers into pirate airlocks, where it expanded and hardened and sealed the raiders inside their own corridors. Medical cutting lasers meant for surgery were overclocked into beams that sliced through pirate boarding tubes, and rescue drones meant to carry survivors were loaded with flashbang charges and sent screaming into pirate docking bays. It was chaos, and it was brilliant, and it was terrifying, because these humans were fighting a war with bandages and stretchers and foam guns, and they were winning. The battle lasted 2 hours, and it was the longest 2 hours of Kelsey's life. And she spent them at the navigation console, calling out gravitational data and calculating firing solutions, and managing the ship's position with a precision that wrung every last advantage from the terrain she had mapped. And twice she saved the ship from torpedo strikes by predicting the projectile paths through the local gravity distortions, and nudging the outstretched hand just enough to let them slob past. The ship shook and groaned and took hits that tore open hull sections and wounded crew members, and alarms screamed through the corridors, but the humans held the line with their teeth and their stubbornness and their refusal to let go. And then the military ships arrived, 3 Terran destroyers dropping out of FTL with weapons hot, and the hollow tongues broke and ran, and the outstretched hand hung in space. Between the retreating pirates and the crippled transport, battered and bleeding atmosphere from a dozen wounds. And alive, Kelsey found Mateo in a damaged corridor afterward, sitting against the bulkhead with shrapnel embedded in his left arm, bleeding steadily onto the deck plates. And he had not reported to medical because he had been directing damage control and checking on his crew, and making sure every single one of his people was accounted for before he would even look at his own wounds. She knelt beside him and pressed her hands against the wound, and her chromatophores were blazing gold rose, that color she had been so afraid of, that color she had run from on the observation deck, and she did not care anymore who saw it, because she had just watched this man fly a rescue ship into a battle he could not win, because 2,000 strangers needed him, and that kind of love for the universe deserved to be answered with every light she had. Exhaustion and pain, and his eyes were still soft, still warm, still those impossible human eyes that looked at people like they mattered. "Told you," he said, "crew." And she said in Spanish she had been secretly studying in her quarters during the night cycles, practicing the sounds until they felt natural on her tongue. No, soy más que eso. No, I am more than that. And he smiled, bleeding and broken and beautiful, and Kelsey held him in the wrecked corridor of a rescue ship that had just done the impossible, and her light was so bright that Dr. Okafor later said she could see it from 3 decks away, like a small golden sun had ignited in the belly of the ship. The galaxy talked, and when the galaxy talked, it talked fast. The story of the outstretched hand spread across 100 species communication networks in less than a standard week, and it spread not in the dry formal language of military reports, but in the raw, unfiltered words of the 2,000 civilians who had been trapped aboard the Wandering Garden, waiting to be taken by slavers, while the void stayed silent around them until a battered human rescue ship came screaming out of nowhere and fought off 3 pirate warships with emergency medical equipment and sheer insanity. The passengers told the story to anyone who would listen, and many of them wept while telling it, and the details they remembered were not tactical, but human. The voice on the intercom saying, "Hold on, help is here," in 7 languages. The rescue workers who came aboard afterward, carrying children on their shoulders and handing out warm blankets and food. The captain, with shrapnel still in his arm, walked the passenger decks personally, checking on every single family before allowing Dr. Okafor to treat him. And they told the story of the Vailani woman on the bridge, whose skin glowed like a star, and who had navigated the ship through an impossible jump, and whose own people had thrown her away like waste, and who had found a home among these strange, wonderful humans. Kelsey became famous overnight, and she hated it. She hated it because fame among the Vailani meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant judgment, and she had spent her whole life trying to be invisible. But the humans aboard the outstretched hand thought it was hilarious, and Torres started calling her superstar. And Big Miriam printed a crude drawing of Kelsey glowing on the observation deck, and taped it to the galley wall with the caption, "Our cartographer can literally outshine you." And Kelsey's chromatophores flushed embarrassed purple every time she saw it, but she never asked them to take it down. Vailani sovereignty responded to the sudden galactic attention the way ancient bureaucracies always responded to embarrassment, with damage control dressed up as concern. A formal diplomatic communication arrived, addressed to Kelsey directly, and it was written in the most elegant high-form Vailani, and it called her valued citizen Kelsey Varanthi, and a credit to the sovereignty's tradition of exploration, and it cordially requested her return to Vailani space, where she would be honored for her bravery, and reinstated to full citizenship with a prestigious posting at the Central Cartographic Institute. Kelsey read the message 3 times, and each time her chromatophore cycled through a different shade of disbelief. 3 months ago, these same people had sent a message that said, "Dispose of her as you see fit," and now they wanted her back, because she was useful, because she was visible, because her story made them look bad, and reclaiming her would make them look better. And they did not even have the grace to acknowledge what they had done. The message contained no apology, and no admission, and no recognition that they had left her to die in the dark. She thought about ignoring it, but then she thought about all the other Vailani out there who had been classified as lost, all the ones who were not lucky enough to be found by a human ship, all the ones who had died alone in the cold, believing that they deserved it, because their culture told them they were already dead. And she decided that ignoring was not enough. She recorded a response and she broadcast it publicly on open channels, and it went everywhere. She stood in the corridor of the outstretched hand, with her chromatophores cycling through steady, calm blue, and she spoke in clear, simple Vailani, and then repeated every word in the Spanish she had learned from Mateo, and then in standard galactic common, so that no one could miss it. I was lost for 42 cycles, and no one came for me. Not a ship, not a signal, not a single word of inquiry. I was written off as dead by my own people before my heart stopped beating. And then a human ship came, a ship full of people who had never met me and owed me nothing, and could not even pronounce my name correctly. And they fed me, and healed me, and gave me a station, and called me crew. She paused, and her light brightened. I learned more about belonging in 3 months with these humans than in a lifetime among my own people. I am not returning to the sovereignty. I am already home. The message hit the galactic networks like a shockwave, and it resonated not just because of what it said about the Veilani, but because of what it said about the species that had saved her. And across 100 worlds, people of a dozen species heard KLC's words, and looked at the humans in their midst with new eyes, and asked themselves uncomfortable questions about their own traditions of abandonment. Indifference. On a Dreth station, a cargo captain who had been saved by the outstretched hand played the message for his crew, and then quietly began funding a Dreth search and rescue initiative, the first in his species' history. On a mining colony in the outer reaches, a mixed species community listened to the broadcast and renamed their central plaza Outstretched Hand Square. And Mateo found out about this and was so embarrassed that his ears turned red, which KLC found completely delightful. The change was slow and imperfect, and it would take years or decades to truly take root, but it had started, and it had started because one lost woman told the truth about what she had found in the dark. But for KLC, the galactic implications were secondary to the personal ones, because there was a conversation she needed to have, and she had been circling it for days, like a ship afraid to enter orbit. She found Mateo on the observation deck during the night cycle, because of course that was where he was, and of course the stars were bright, and of course he was sitting in his usual spot with that expression of quiet distance that she now understood was not coldness, but the geography of grief. The landscape of a man who had loved someone completely and lost her, and was still learning how to carry the weight. She sat beside him, and for a long time they were quiet together, which was one of the things she loved about him, that he never needed to fill silence with noise, that he understood the value of two people simply being in the same space. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay," he said. "The color, the gold and rose one, the one you asked about before, the one I ran from." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were patient, and she could see that he already knew, had probably known for weeks, because humans were perceptive in ways that other species consistently underestimated. "There is no exact," she said, "but the closest concept in your language is love felt for the first time by someone who believed they were incapable of it." She said it, and her chromatophores did not stutter, not once, and the gold-rose pattern blazed across her skin, so bright and steady that it painted the walls of the observation deck in warm light. And she thought that maybe her broken, stuttering skin had never actually been broken. Maybe it had just been waiting for something worth saying. Mateo reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pendant on a chain, a simple thing made of hammered metal with a tiny blue stone, and she knew what it was because he had told her. It was the last thing Elena had made before she died, and he had carried it against his chest for 3 years like a talisman against forgetting. He held it in his palm and looked at it, and then he looked at KLC, and his eyes were bright with tears, but his voice was steady. He said she was the kind of person who would fly into a nebula to find someone. He closed his hand around the pendant, and then he opened a small box on the shelf beside him and placed it inside, carefully, gently, not discarding it, but giving it a resting place, a home instead of a weight. Then he took KLC's hand. "I was lost too," he said. "Different kind of lost, same kind of found." And KLC leaned into him, and his arm came around her, and humans ran warm, so much warmer than Veilani, and his warmth soaked into her like sunlight, and her light soaked into him, and they sat together on the observation deck of a battered rescue ship and watched the stars turn, and neither of them was lost anymore. Housing by Torres, who had done it without asking and spelled it wrong, and then corrected it, and then added a small star next to it, because he said every navigator needed a lucky star. Mateo was in the command chair, and Commander Vasquez was at tactical, and Chen was at navigation, running the routes that Kelsey had mapped. And Dr. Okafor was in the medbay, humming, and Torres was somewhere in the guts of the ship, singing, and Big Miriam was in the galley, making something that smelled incredible. And the music was playing in the corridors, always playing, always filling the ship with that intangible human magic that made metal and wire and recycled air feel like home. Kelsey opened her journal for the last time, and she wrote carefully, in both Vailani script and in the Spanish alphabet she had learned to love. The Vailani say that to be lost is to be already dead. The humans say something different. They say no one gets left behind. And I have studied 14 species across 200 star systems, and I have mapped nebulae and gravity wells and the spaces between worlds. But the most extraordinary thing I have ever charted is this. The distance between being alone and being loved is exactly one human heart. She closed the journal and looked up at the viewport, where the stars waited, full of signals, full of voices calling out in the dark, asking if anyone was listening, asking if anyone cared enough to come. The outstretched hand always answered. Kelsey's chromatophores glowed gold rose, steady and bright and unbroken. And the ship jumped to faster than light, and carried its crew of loud, stubborn, impossible, beautiful humans, and one Vailani woman who was no longer lost, toward the next soul in the dark, who needed to know the most important thing the galaxy had ever failed to learn. That someone was coming, that someone would always come, that in a cold and indifferent universe there was a small warm species from a small wet planet who looked at the void and said, no, not today, not on our watch, not while we still have hands to reach and ships to fly and hearts stubborn enough to break for strangers. And the void, vast and ancient and utterly merciless, had no answer for that. End of end.